Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. We are delighted to have joining us as our feature interview guest this week, Leslie Palti-Guzman, founder of Energy Vista, a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And she's going to make us all jealous by being in New York, and we're not today. So welcome from New York, Leslie.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me, and I'm delighted to. My second time on Gulf Intelligence podcast, so very happy
Well,
to.
you're then a regular. We can call you a regular commentator. So you've passed the threshold. Thank you for joining us. I mean, there's no shortage of things to kick into, but I'd like to start with the slightly. Obviously, you're in America, you're in the US, and the sort of biggest sort of geopolitical, geoeconomic uh, development in the last week or so has been what appears to be yet another, what's become the phrased as the taco, where the president of the United States reverses or does a U-turn or steps back from implementation, but most notably in the aftermath of recent elections in New York and other elections, that this issue of inflation has surged back to the headlines in the US, and with it, Trump making a U-turn on his much loved tariff policies. Your thoughts on that? The scale of that? Is that an overselling of the situation? How do you see Trump's decision making around tariffs and trade war going forward?
Absolutely. So, part of his agenda when he arrived for the second time in the White House has been to um, create, the energy dominance agenda and the bilateral trade deals, notably with tariffs, to initiate the US reindustrialization. So those are two big focus of his agenda. Let me give you an example on the energy side of things. One of the first things he did when he arrived was to lift the LNG export pause to unleash US liquid gold, notably liquefied natural gas. So it was not just an energy decision, but it was also a geo-economic decision for me, because it signaled to allies and competitors that the US is not going to abort too fast and prematurely its energy bonanza, its competitive advantage, basically. And it will not cede market shares to non-OECD suppliers, notably. And that US energy is going to remain central to the exchanges to trade. And on the second front, on the bilateral transactional trade deals and tariffs, a big emphasis in his agenda is to recreate jobs at home. And also, it's completely intertwined with its relationship with the US relationship with China right now, that they see as a competitor that China is dominating many sectors right now, critical mineral.
Let's just
Yeah.
look at that point you just made there, because I would maybe challenge the thesis a little bit. I mean, I never thought Joe Biden's pause on the LNG licensing was that big a deal, although obviously it was made into a big deal in the sense that it was future licenses that had yet to come, and it was the election, and it was sort of maybe sort of giving some gesture to the energy transition constituents on his left of his party or whatever. But it didn't. It's what strikes me as a much more surprising outcome from the election till now, or the Trump 2.0, is the opposite of Trump showing love to the US energy industry, but the opposite, delivering through his geopolitical pressures and elsewhere a lower oil price environment, a lower opportunity environment, a pause. There's no drill, baby, drill. It does appear that there's not a great love affair going on with the Houston energy industry. Your thoughts on that as being more a surprise than, unpausing the LNG licensing?
I think there are contradictions in the agenda, but I still think that the US is de facto the largest world LNG and oil exporter right now and producer.
Producer, but not exporter, I think, of oil, but of LNG,
right.
yes.
And so what it means is, so it not only lifted the pause for future exports for new liquefaction plants, but also it gave green light, new permits to ones that were a little blocked in the pipeline of authorization. So there is really a movement for unleashing, and then the market decides if they invest in the projects or not, and if the buyers are going to sign the long-term contracts, and if the financing will go along. But in terms of the contradiction in the agenda, yes, prices in the US should not go too high, right? Because it's very sensitive, the price of the gas pump in the US. And at the same time, some of the politics could, create inflation. Even building more ships in the US with the shipbuilding initiative to basically bring back this value chain that has completely been outsourced to China, South Korea, Japan, to bring back this shipbuilding at home requires steels, it requires labor force. So having restrictions on visa or having, tariffs on steel is not going to help necessarily with this agenda. I agree.
I mean, if we just come back to the sort of main thesis of the recent development, which is the reversal, right, of trade tariff strategies. I know it's on food and food related, but if we're looking at America becoming the biggest LNG exporter and is obviously Europe is turning their dependency on Russia now to a dependency on the US and increasingly the LNG moving into Asia from the US. But given the Trump unpredictableness and the Trump sort of reversal on different things, can long-term buyers of US LNG rely on this policy? Can they sign contracts with confidence when it's continuously being changed and unpredictable and reversals? I mean, we saw spectacularly the European wind energy company Ostend losing its business in the US. Trump shut it down overnight. So I'm just wondering, is there a risk at the predictability? Does the LNG industry in the US like the Trump unpredictability when they're trying to sign up long-term deals around the world?
So what we need to understand is that the world has changed. From the Biden administration to the Trump administration, we're in a different world. The old alliances are gone. And we're trying all, to scratch our head on what's going to be the next world order, right? And for the US, it's creating new alliances with trusted partners that bring something to the table. We have the visit of the Crown Prince this week in the US. There will be discussions around energy, investments, but also Saudi normalization potentially with Israel, buying aircrafts, getting maybe security guarantee, cooperation on nuclear. Those are big portfolios of discussions, and they each bring something to the table. So I think we're in a different world where we should not compare necessarily what was before and now, but try to imagine, in which world we want to live. I think there are concerns, in Europe specifically with the US position. One is, will America first agenda and Henry Hub prices, if they spike, is that going to constrain US LNG exports? I don't think so. Another concern is European gas dependency with Russia going to be replaced with an American dependency? I don't think so, because we're talking about two different animals. One was weaponizing gas to wage wars, whether economic wars or real physical war. And, the US is still a capitalist country with many different players that don't follow, like the molecule doesn't follow what the administration is selling. The molecule is following the prices. And if there are maritime trade disruption, they have to go around and find new routes. They follow the money. They follow the buyers. They don't follow the words from the White House.
Yeah, kind of, I suppose, sort of. That's if you're not in Venezuela and there's an armada sitting on your doorstep and Chevron waiting in the wings. I mean, there's all sorts of things that coexist together. Looking at the sort of world from the other side of things, China and China's sort of role in the speaking of LNG and looking at as we've had in oil for a long time, swing producers and so forth. The language now of China emerging as the new swing buyer in global LNG through its strategic approach to contracting and stockpiling. I mean, does China hold the power in the buying form, or does US hold the power as the seller? I mean, of course, in Europe, there's a lot of geopolitics interwoven. You'll buy our LNG or we'll break up NATO kind of threat. In China, that's not really applicable. Where does China stand as a kind of a swing buyer in global LNG?
Yeah, so China is definitely a swing buyer. For some time now, it has been, and I think it could increasingly become a swing supplier of LNG. So,
Supplier.
yeah, so China is by far the world's largest LNG importer. They imported about 80 million tons of LNG last year, way ahead of Japan, because China has shaped its strategy around optionalities, diversification, but also geopolitics. So it's not just a matter of what's the growth of the market in China, it's also how they've been using their market clout to hedge. And so China has numerous energy alternatives right now. It has diversified its gas supply stack with domestic production, and now they produce more gas than Qatar or Canada, for instance. They have also huge pipeline supply from Russia, but also Central Asia. And they have, LNG imports from different parts of the world. And they have other energies that they can rely on their renewable, on their nuclear, on coal, right? So LNG is a portion of their portfolio, but they have options. And that's
And
what...
so in that optionality, they would be happy to buy American LNG if it's the right price, if it's the right spot market. Would they do a 25-year deal of supply deal with US LNG, or how do you see that relationship?
So they have in the past signed long-term contracts. I think it was also part of their strategy to make sure that when they signed them, a few years ago, it would bring reasonable prices to China, right? The more they invest or the more they sign long-term contracts with Qatar or with the US, it creates momentum for those new projects, which in turn become new supply. And right now we may head into an oversupply market, which, low prices fit China's strategy. But I think, to the point of the swing supplier, it means that China may have over-contracted volumes. And it has already resold cargoes, but it may...
It has that optionality to redirect cargoes it's already bought.
Exactly. And increasingly...
Qatar can be quite restrictive about those things.
Absolutely. So we'll see how it pans out. But they have a few years to get ready for this, when we are really in a glut, and they can, adjust some of their strategy. But I think that could be an option for them.
When we see the Europeans accelerating their attempts to sort of disconnect from Russian gas, obviously pipeline gas has been more or less done despite a few pockets in Eastern Europe, but now they want to accelerate the end of LNG imports from Russia. What is your outlook for that? They're achieving that accelerated end to LNG buying from Russia, and what would then happen to that Russian LNG?
Evolved with its energy policy, and now it's trying to balance at least three imperatives. One is phasing out all Russian molecules, potentially by 2027, keeping its economy running, and being competitive. And at the same time, it has still an ambitious climate targets. So what I see is that it had to become more pragmatic this year because it has seen its wars on its border. And it had to soften a little bit its climate agenda at a time when it needs to remove what's left of Russian gas, because it means that Europe will have to rely more on non-Russian gas for a longer time than it admits. And that was not part of their agenda a few years ago. So this idea of decarbonization or moving away from US LNG or Qatari LNG will take more time.
Well, there's certainly an issue at the moment, and I was at a talk the other day by the Qatar energy minister, who was saying that if EU doesn't amend its ESG rules regarding suppliers, that Qatar may stop supplying LNG into Europe.
Yeah, that's a threat that Qatar has repeated several times. So this directive is about sustainability and also human rights. I think Qatar is mostly concerned about the human rights components because of alleged, forced labor, like we saw during the World Cup and so on. So it's not only opening up your supply chain to show that it's more sustainable, but it's also showing that you're making efforts with human rights. So Qatar has been very harsh and has threatened several times the European Union to soften its rigid because it's an extraterritorial law.
Well, it's like the Americans do all the time, right?
Yeah, but sometimes I'm thinking that Qatar may be bluffing, because does Qatar really needs the European market right now? No. If you look at Europe's imports of LNG plus pipeline, they only import 4% from Qatar. So the rest mostly is coming now from Norway, first supplier to Europe, the US, second supplier. And because of the maritime disruptions we see with the Red Sea being under attack by the Houthi from Yemen, and bottleneck also around the Panama Canal, we've seen a division of the markets between US molecules staying in the Atlantic basin, and the Qatari molecules staying in the Pacific basin. So we have a kind of a division of market share right now.
Has the sort of ongoing problem in the Red Sea, Suez Canal contributed to that, permanently altering the LNG trading routes?
So that's a very good question. It's hard to tell if it's going to be permanent or not, but we definitely seen a vast restructuration in the trade flows over the past 2 years and rerouting of LNG cargo. So at one point in 2024, we had 94% of LNG bound to Asia from the US, bypassing the Panama Canal, bypassing the Suez Canal, and using the Cape of Good Hope, which is adding days of transit and costs. So, it's a myth to think that the market is in a better place without a major route like the Suez Canal. It's not. But it happens that we had enough vessels to go around, to adapt. And because the market was, well supplied in terms of tanker capacity, it really helped. But I think in the future, US LNG trade routes, it's going to depend on who are the consumers, right? If Europe continues to be the largest consumer of US LNG, which it is now, it's not a big deal. If Asia becomes again the premium market, and Asia is meant to become the engine of growth for LNG eventually, we need to restore those routes.
Do we need to see for that to happen, for Asia really to reclaim it's sort of, we had that obviously over the history of the last 40 years or so, Japan, South Korea, China, building, massive and very up-to-date infrastructure to regasify, and the whole supply chain of the LNG infrastructure from the export to the import. But we see a number of countries in Asia still struggling. Bangladesh, most notably, Pakistan, these sort of medium-sized countries, although they're massive populations, 200 million people, but they can't seem to get around to building importing infrastructure, permanent onshore infrastructure, regasification. Is there any indication that these fairly substantial markets in Asia, secondary to China and Japan, of course, but nonetheless growing fast, can build the LNG importing infrastructure, can access the capital needed in order to absorb what is a lot of capacity building on the exporting side?
Yeah, and Sean, that's a key question because as we're heading into a very well-supplied LNG market later this decade, I mean the second half of this decade, whether it's going to be a full-blown glut is going to depend on two things. One is the pace of the startups of the projects. As we know, suppliers can always delay the output and manage the output, but the other one is the demand, like the speed of the opening up of new demand centers. And here, like South Asia, Southeast Asia is going to be key because they have a potential to move away from coal and to use more gas, especially if gas becomes affordable. But, it's a big question mark. We have also, other potential new demand centers opening. Everybody's talking about AI, right? And demand centers. Where are they going to be located? Will they need natural gas or other energies, depending on where they are? In the US, clearly, gas is going to be part of the story. In Asia, it remains to be seen.
When you say gas will be part of the story in the US, will it not be a significant major part? I mean, you can't build nuclear power plants very quickly.
Absolutely. So that's the reason why natural gas will be needed in the short, medium term. Some tech company are trying to co-locate already near existing nuclear plant or building their own complex of renewable plus. We have to see,
I mean, as you see in the stock markets, given they are such the big AI or what the big seven tech companies, as they're called, that they're such a massive part of the valuation of the stock market, and built into that valuation is the belief of the full realization of the AI opportunity. And yet, on the other side of that coin is a real energy supply choke point, that the amount of energy required to drive that scale of AI opportunity, particularly the US, seems to have a real disconnect to it. What are your thoughts on that? And does that get resolved? And while maintaining the valuations of the stock market?
Yeah, so it's as much, cloud story as infrastructure hardware story, right? We need transmission lines, we need new pipelines, we need gas turbine, all those materials, components.
And you need rare earths.
And we need rare earths, yeah, potentially. So yeah, I think it's a multi-sectorial, multidisciplinary, multi-agency approach, and everybody needs to be hands in deck, especially because this administration has wants to win this AI race, right? Like whatever it means, but all the resources and a lot of efforts are put into it, and the US is well positioned because it has energy. Now it needs to bring the energy where it's needed.
And on that point, I mean, you said earlier that the international customers of US LNG, with the opening up of the licensing, with the Trump return, can depend on this reliable LNG supply coming out of the US, the largest in the world, etc. But then on the other side, you have this huge requirement domestically for an AI industry that is, the headlines would certainly indicate, as George, or not George, but Donald Trump would say, oh, it's massive, it's going to be the most beautiful AI in the world. But ultimately, it's of scale. Can the US LNG suppliers continue to grow and supply the world with LNG and be the world's largest LNG exports, at the same time have the gas supply at home for this AI vision?
Yeah, and I wrote about it. It's only one scenario. the competition between the AI market and the export market. But we're far from there right now. And the US has plenty of natural gas that waits to be explored, right? If Henry Hub goes up, then you have all the dry gas that has been, fairly untouched right now because prices were too low, and most of the producers have focused on the associated gas that is produced at the same time as oil. But so you have, and if we're able to bring pipelines to bring this dry gas to the markets, then you open up, a lot of new resources too.
Let's just wrap up with the more sort of immediate outlook. We're sitting on the doorstep of Christmas, the end of the year, so 2026 looms large. The AI opportunity, those sort of urban horizon possibilities that are brought in 2030 and so forth. But what about just next year, January 2026? It's 6 weeks away now. What does 2026 look like, do you think? What are the critical shifts that might shape the future of the global gas markets in the year ahead?
So I think, the global gas trade has become more politicized, will remain more geopolitically driven, and we're evolving in a more fragmented world. So that will remain the case, but I think increasingly buyers will get
any particular geopolitical stresses that you point to?
I mean, it's the whole kind of regionalization versus globalization, right? We see an emphasis on more regional trade. And one of the positives that I see with this evolution is that because we're heading in a more well-supplied market, is that the buyers are going to potentially get a relief, right? With much lower spot prices as more supply comes online, notably from North America and Qatar. So like the things that I'm going to watch and monitor closely is the Qatar-US relation, and whether we're going to see a collusion or a collision, because there are the two LNG giants coming online with almost each doubling their capacity in the coming years. And the big question is, are they going to compete for market share, a race to the bottom for prices? So that's going to be interesting to watch. The other thing is something we touched on, like how is America's reinventing its all of the above energy? So, gas, oil, yes, but what about nuclear and geothermal? The US is putting a lot of research and development right now on nuclear fusion, and tries to be a leader in the next generation of nuclear plants. So that's something to watch too.
What about the possibility of the Suez Canal returning to normal next year? The conflict in Yemen eases off, and there's the ability to free flow traffic through the Suez Canal.
Yeah, and actually there was a vote, I think, 2 days ago at the UN Council, or like very recently, on being more aggressive with the Houthi and trying to avoid them to get weapons and those kind of resources. So I think the international community is not going to ignore what they are doing. They've been basically taking hostage, not only actually crew members, but also taking hostage the whole trade, global trade, for more than 2 years. I think it's about to change potentially. They've been quiet. We haven't seen as many attacks as in the first part of the year and last year.
Seems in some ways international trade, energy included, has got comfortable with going around the Straits of Hormuz around the Horn of Africa, because they're not in a hurry to get to their destination. Container ships are, but maybe not energy with the quite ample supply currently. Listen, we have to wrap it up there. This is the halftime talk, so there's a whole nother half of the week to get through, so we could talk all the way through it. Listen, Leslie Palti-Guzman, thank you so much for joining us. Really pleasure to have you, what we now might consider a regular commentator on the Gulf Intelligence Halftime Talk platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean.